In this video, Bobby Fischer is going to destroy Boris Spassky, Viktor Korchnoi, and several other world-class grandmasters using his favorite chess opening as white, the Ruy Lopez opening. Now, Bobby's first victim in this video series is Boris Spassky. It is the 1972 World Championship match between the American and the former Soviet Union. In the game, Bobby Fischer opened 1e4 best by test, and from there he hit straight for his favorite opening, the Ruy Lopez opening with the move 3 bishop b5. Now, I gotta say, this game was simply unbelievable. In the game, Bobby plays a series of moves that was so spectacular, even the commentators themselves could not believe it. Now, real fast, in case you're a beginner, this is the Ruy Lopez with the move bishop b5. This is Bobby Fischer's favorite opening as white. The idea is very simple. He wants to put pressure on that knight on the c6 square. Of course, he's threatening at some point bishop takes c6 and knight takes e5. And beyond that, white also wants to castle very quickly and then try to build a beautiful pawn center with the moves c3 and d4. So overall, the Ruy Lopez is a very, very strong and flexible opening. Now here, black has a wide variety of responses. In the game, Boris Spassky goes for the closed Ruy Lopez, starting with the move a6. So knocking back the bishop. Here, Bobby is a big fan of that exchange variation with the move bishop takes c6, but instead in the game, it goes bishop to a4. This is the stronger move, trying to keep that key light-squared bishop alive in the game. Now from here, black goes knight to f6, challenging the pawn on the 4 square. Bobby castles, the best move. And now bishop e7 blocks the e-file. Rook e1 defends the pawn on the e4 square. And finally, the last few moves heading to the starting point of this opening variation. b5, knocking back the bishop, and then finally defending the pawn on the e5 square with the move d6. So this is the real starting point of the closed variation of the Ruy Lopez. This is what Boris Spassky had in mind against Bobby Fischer in this particular game. Now, black's idea is very simple. He has a very sturdy pawn center here with the pawns on c7, d6, and e5. He's just going to castle and then somehow try to get counterplay going on the queen side, perhaps with the move c5 at some point, trying to increase his stake in the center. Now from here, Bobby goes down the main line for white, c3, setting up future d4 ideas. Black goes ahead and castles. And now, of course, d4 immediately is possible. However, black can get a lot of pressure on white's center with a very fast bishop g4. So with that in mind, here Bobby plays the main idea, h3, taking control of the g4 square. This is the last move he has to play before he is ready to break in the center with the move d4. Now here in this position on move 9, black has an enormous number of different ideas. For example, there's the Gligoric with knight a5, the Zaitsev with bishop b7 or rook to e8, and there are a bunch of other ideas. We're going to see all the main lines for black in this game, or in this video series, sorry. However, here in this particular game, Boris Spassky goes for a very popular idea, that is knight to b8. This is the start of the Breyer variation. Now, black's idea here is very simple. He wants to reroute that knight away from c6 over to the d7 square via b8. When the knight was on c6, it actually blocks the c-pawn. Black wants to go c5. Therefore, the knight is a little bit misplaced. So knight b8 is a move trying to reroute the knight to a better square. And from there, black's going to have excellent development. He's going to go bishop b7, rook e8, bishop f8. From there, the rook puts a lot of pressure on white's center on the e4 square. And black's going to have a very harmonious setup with most of his pieces on very good squares. Now, the downside of this move, it is a little bit slow, and it releases the tension in the center. Here, white can simply go d4, and white's also going to be able to get all of his pieces on very, very good squares. Now here, black goes knight d7, continuing development. Bobby Fischer, knight d2, the standard idea in the Ruy Lopez opening. Perhaps he wants to go knight to f1 and then knight g3 later. That is the standard Ruy Lopez route for the knight. Now here, black goes bishop b7, the best square for the bishop. The bishop exerts a ton of pressure on white's center here. Now, of course, if white wants to go knight f1 at g3, he has to increase the defense of that e4 pawn, the knight and the bishop currently attacking it. Currently, only the knight and the rook defend. That's 2 attackers, 2 defenders. Therefore, Bobby goes bishop c2, increasing the defense of the e4 pawn. Now he is ready to go knight f1 and knight g3 if he wants to. Now here, Boris Spassky, rook to e8, the standard idea in the Ruy Lopez opening. Here, black wants to go bishop f8. And from there, if black ever takes on d4, the rook will be exerting pressure on white's pawn on the e4 square. So now, Bobby Fischer here, if he wants to get his knight over to the g3 square, he has to do it immediately. Otherwise, black is going to go bishop f8. He's going to have too much pressure on that e4 pawn, particularly with the idea of e takes d4, and then the rook lining up with the pawn on the e4 square. However, in this game, Bobby Fischer does not go knight f1. That is his standard move in this position. Instead, he uncorks a brilliant idea, b4, expanding on the queen side. This was the first big shock of this game in the 1972 World Championship match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. Now, real fast, what is Bobby's idea? Well, first of all, there is the obvious. He's gaining space on the queen side. He's locking down black's pawn chain on a6 and b5. Beyond that, he may also want to further expand on the queen side with the move a4. Then, of course, that b pawn is locked. There's no b4 ideas from black. And then white can either further expand with the move a5 or open up the a file for his rook with a takes b5. So that is the most obvious part of Bobby's plan. However, beyond that, there's another idea. He's trying to take Boris Spassky out of his opening preparation. Bobby knows he is a chess genius. So if he can get Boris Spassky out of his preparation into a position that he's not familiar with, he knows he's going to wipe the floor with Boris Spassky. So that is a big part of his idea, trying to get a unique position on the board. Now from here, black goes bishop f8, the standard idea. And now Bobby a4, expanding on the queen side, by far the best move. Now, this whole idea with b4 and a4 is super rare. In fact, 13b4 is only played 7% of the time in that position. So Bobby really trying to go for uncharted territory here. Now, in this position, Boris Spassky has a wide variety of plans. He could kind of just wait and stay solid. For example, moves like rook c8, h6, maybe g6 are all possible here. Instead, here he goes for a much more combative idea, knight to b6. Now, this is a very aggressive move in the Ruy Lopez. Here, black is threatening knight takes a4 or b takes a4, trying to win a pawn. Then, if white wants to win the pawn back, he's going to have to give up his light-squared bishop on c2. And that light-squared bishop is just so important in white's position. It's a star piece. It's the Ruy Lopez bishop. And without that Ruy Lopez bishop, the light-squared bishop, it's going to be almost impossible for white to get a proper attack going against the black king later in the game. So here, you cannot simply allow knight takes a4 or b takes a4. So with that in mind, Bobby, he goes a5, further expanding on the queen side, hitting the knight. The knight is forced to go back. Knight d7 was played in the game. There's no other good square for the knight here. And now we have a very interesting pawn structure on the queen side with these pawns completely blocked. The a5 and b4 pawns for white, the light squares for black on a6 and b5. And now the only way to get any sort of break going on the queen side is going to be either c4 or c5 from black. So let's see if Bobby Fischer wants to go into that idea or if he wants to attack somewhere else on the board. From here, he simply continues bishop b2, a very good move. And surprisingly, the dark-squared bishop is very well placed here. I mean, b2 is not the standard square for white's dark-squared bishop in the Ruy Lopez, especially in the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez. But here, it works out extremely well. Now, in this position, I would have expected Boris Spassky to do something like, say, rook to c8, setting up c5. However, here, he played a move that completely shocked me as well as the commentators. Queen to b8. What an incredible idea by black. What's the idea? Well, b8 is actually a decent square for the black queen in a lot of lines, especially the 8a4 anti-martial. Here, black, first of all, the queen is supporting the e5 pawn. That could be important if he goes c5 in the future. And beyond that, black now has the c8 square available for the rook on the e8 square. So we could have the rook, the queen, and the other rook lined up on the a, b, and c files. I mean, that could be an optimal placement if the queen side gets blown open. Now, the problem with this move is white has a ton of different ways to fight against it. And here, Bobby plays an absolutely brilliant move. I mean, this is a shocker. Rook to b1, simply lining up the rook with the queen. Now, what's the idea here? Obviously, Bobby Fischer knows the b file is currently closed. However, Bobby also knows at some point black is going to have to go b5, try to expand on the queen side, and when black does that, Bobby is going to be ready. He's going to go b takes c5, opening up the b file for the rook, and what do you know? The rook is going to be perfectly lined up with the black queen. That's going to create all sorts of tactical opportunities for Bobby. So what a brilliant idea by Bobby Fischer here. Now in the game, Boris Spassky, he has nothing better than c5, and that is what he does. And here, Bobby shows his idea. B takes c5, immediately trying to open up that b file. And very importantly, the other ideas like d takes e5 are no good. However, d5 was also quite playable, but again, Bobby going for his idea of opening up the b file for the rook, trying to expose that black queen on the b8 square. Now here, Boris Spassky has to find the right recapture. You can take the pawn on the c5 square or on d4 actually. Well, real fast, e takes d4 is not a good move because then after c takes d4, white's going to get a very, very powerful center. And if black ever continues d takes c5, then white can go e5, just trying to blow open the game. And his bishops on b2 and c2 are going to be so incredibly powerful. So with that in mind here, the best move is d takes c5. And this is what Boris Spassky played in the game. However, Bobby was 100% ready for this idea. Here, he simply takes on the e5 square, d takes e5, and here's the idea. After black takes back with the knight, Bobby jumps in with his own knight, knight takes e5, then the queen takes. Of course, that move is completely forced. And here is yet another brilliant idea by Bobby Fischer. c4, opening up the line of attack with the bishop on the black queen and also trying to open up the queen side, trying to give him more lines of attack into the black position. So, a brilliant idea. Bobby showing full use of this idea of both rook to b1 and bishop b2. Not a standard square for the bishop in the Ruy Lopez, but it works out fabulously here. Now in the game, black has to move the queen. Where is Boris Spassky going to move it to? Well, the best move and the move he finds in the game is a shocker, queen to f4. You typically don't see the queen on this square in the Ruy Lopez, but there's nothing else black can do. For example, if black were to retreat the queen to the standard square for the queen in the Ruy Lopez, queen to c7, then simply e5 is just crushing for Bobby Fischer. So instead, you have to keep the queen over here, closer to the defense of the king side, where it can better stop white's aggressive ideas. Now here, Bobby, once again, he has a very specific idea in mind for this position. Here, instead of slow playing it, instead of going, say, queen to e2 or something similar to that, here he just knocks off the knight on the f6 square. Bishop takes f6 as the move. What's the idea? Well, let's find out. Here, Boris Spassky, of course, takes back with the queen. You can't go g takes f6 and just obliterate your pawn structure. But now Bobby Fischer, c takes b5. Again, showing the depth of his ideas. The move c4 earlier wasn't just about exposing the black queen to the white bishop on b2. It was also about trying to blow open the black queen side and get more lines of attack. So, absolutely brilliant. And if Bobby didn't play that move right then in that position, black might even be fighting for an advantage. For example, here, Bobby played any other move, say knight to f3, then Boris Spassky could close the queen side with the move b4, and Bobby would never have that opportunity again, and Boris Spassky would have that passed pawn on the b4 square. So back here on move 23, c takes b5, an absolutely brilliant move by Bobby Fischer. Now, as we can see, all of Bobby's ideas in this game are coming to fruition. The bishop on b2 serving his purpose, and now the rook on b1 eyeing the b5 square. If black takes back on b5, then rook takes b5 is going to be the move. And suddenly, that rook is just incredibly active. So with that in mind, here, Boris Spassky tries to do something different. He doesn't want to give Bobby Fischer exactly what he wants. Now, if he's not going to take on b5, what are his options? Well, it turns out the best idea is going to be getting one of these rooks to the d8 square, where it is lining up with Bobby Fischer's queen on d1. So with that in mind, rook e to d8 is the move for Boris Spassky. Now, this move is a little bit surprising. I would have expected rook a d8, trying to get both of those rooks on those central files. However, Boris Spassky has a very specific idea in mind with this. After rook e d8, he wants to keep his other rook over on the queen side, where it will help with the defense of these pawns, and he may be more active over there. Now here, Bobby Fischer, he sees the threat. He sees his knight on the d2 square is pinned to the queen. He can't allow that. So, with that in mind, queen c1 is the move for Bobby. Now, this move does address the threat, the queen, of course, no longer being in the line of sight of the black rook. However, it is a little bit slow overall, and here, black, he may have an opportunity to try and get something going. Now here, we still have a tremendous amount of tension on the queen side with those pawns. Is Boris Spassky going to take one of those pawns, or just leave the tension there for now? Well, in the game, he plays yet another shocking idea, queen to c3, both maintaining all of the tension on the queen side and bringing his queen into the heart of Bobby Fischer's territory. Boris Spassky playing a very gutsy move here. This queen could be vulnerable to all sorts of ideas. For example, rook to b3 is coming potentially, and that rook could swing over to the king side, creating all sorts of threats against the black king. Now, Boris Spassky, in this position, what should he be doing? Well, first of all, there is all this tension on the queen side. Is he going to release the tension somehow, or does he have some other idea in mind? Well, it turns out it's the latter. In this position, instead of, say, a takes b5, the obvious move, here Boris Spassky throws a big curveball, queen to c3, bringing his queen into the heart of Bobby Fischer's territory. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, besides the queen just being a menace here, it is also threatening queen takes a5, trying to pick up that extra pawn. And if Bobby just sits back and tries to defend it, that actually could backfire for him, as Boris Spassky here is getting too active. So Bobby makes a very gutsy decision. He decides to give up that pawn on the a5 square. Instead, he just continues his development with the move knight to f3. Now here, the battle lines are being drawn. Boris Spassky is going to win the pawn on the a5 square. That is exactly what happens. Queen takes a5, and he may even win the pawn on the b5 square a little bit later. However, Bobby Fischer, his advantages are on the opposite side of the board. His big advantage is the queen, the bishop, and the knight all potentially lining up with the black king. I mean, you can just see if Bobby Fischer ever gets the move e5 in, and then perhaps swings the queen over to the king's side, his queen and his bishop, maybe even his knight on g5, could be menacing the black king. So, that may be his idea. Now, in this position, Bobby, he makes a very controversial decision. He does not take the pawn on the a6 square. Instead, he simply goes bishop b3, rerouting his bishop to a completely different diagonal. Now, instead of potentially eyeing the h7 squares, now eyeing f7, another incredibly weak square in the black position. Now, the drawback of this move, of course, is black can just take on b5, and that is what Boris Spassky does in the game here. A takes b5, and now look at this. Boris Spassky with the 2 versus 0 pawn majority on the queen side, those two connected passed pawns. He's actually threatening to go c4 on the next move, trapping the bishop, blocking it off this diagonal. And simply forcing the bishop off this diagonal here, it would no longer be attacking the black king or that pawn on the f7 square. So what is Bobby going to do? He has to act right now if he wants to get anything going. Well, in the game, he goes queen to f4, an excellent idea, increasing the pressure on f7. Now, of course, Bobby is threatening checkmate in 2 moves. Simply queen takes f7, then king h8, and then queen to g8, the queen being supported by the bishop on the b3 square. So, of course, Boris has to do something right now. But the question is, what's the right idea? First of all, you may be thinking, what about c4 immediately, just trying to cut off the bishop? Well, that move doesn't quite work out. Again, thanks to Bobby Fischer's brilliant move, rook to b1, so many moves earlier. Here, Bobby can play the idea, bishop takes c4, a brilliant move, giving up the bishop, but if black takes it, then bang, rook takes b7, wins back the bishop, and then from there, the rook and the queen will be lining up on that f7 square all the same. So c4 in this position does not work for Boris Spassky at all. Instead, he plays a more defensive idea, rook d7, trying to manually defend that f7 square with the rook. However, Bobby, he's having none of it. He jumps in with his knight to the very strong e5 square, knight to e5. And now just look at that knight. That may be the star piece in this position, forking both the rook and the f7 pawn. Bobby threatening queen takes f7 or bishop takes or knight takes in all sorts of variations here. Now, instead of defending the rook, if he moves the rook to, say, c7 or anywhere else, then again, knight takes f7 or bishop takes could be coming next. So instead here, Boris Spassky, he plays a brilliant move, queen to c7. What's the idea? Well, first of all, that rook is not hanging. You cannot take it. If Bobby Fischer takes the rook on d7, knight takes d7, then, of course, the move is queen takes f4. The queen is no longer defended, and that will be game over on the spot. So Bobby, being the stable genius he is, he does not take the rook on the d7 square in this incredible Ruy Lopez opening game. Instead, he finds a much stronger idea, rook b to d1, lining up the rook with the rook on the d7 square, threatening simply rook takes d7, and of course, that being supported by the knight on e5, black's going to have to act immediately. Now here, the obvious move for Boris Spassky is going to be rook takes d1. What happens if black does that? Well, it turns out that is a massive mistake. Before you take back the rook e takes d1, you can actually go bishop takes f7 check, the intermediate move, winning back a pawn, and your attack is just too fast. Now here, Boris Spassky, what should he be doing in this position? Well, first of all, the obvious idea is what happens if you take the rook on the d1 square? Well, I do want to show you this variation. It didn't happen in the game, but this just shows you the depth of Bobby Fischer's ideas in this game. If black were to take on d1, then you almost have a forced checkmate. Here, the idea is bishop takes f7. You force the king to the h8 square. The only move that stops checkmate is actually queen takes f7, but you don't want to play that as black. Instead, if Boris Spassky were to go king to h8, then Bobby Fischer's idea would have been knight to g6, the brilliant move. The pawn is forced to take the knight on g6. There's no other move. Then after h takes, you just go queen to h4, and that is checkmate. So when Bobby Fischer moved the rook over to the d1 square, it wasn't just offering a trade of rooks. It was setting up a nasty checkmating idea that would have shocked the chess world. Now, here, Boris Spassky, being the number 2 rated player in the world, he finds the idea. Instead of taking on d1 with the rook, he just goes rook to e7. Again, maintaining that defense of that f7 pawn. Now, this is an absolutely critical position in this game. If Bobby Fischer wants to win the 1972 World Championship match against Boris Spassky, he has to find the right idea in this Ruy Lopez opening game. And here he connects. He simply takes on f7 with the bishop. Bishop takes f7, by far the best move. Here's the idea. The pieces start flying off the board. Rook takes, the queen takes, the queen takes, the knight takes. And here Boris Spassky, he stops and he slows down. The obvious move is king takes f7, but that runs into a beautiful tactical shot. If he takes the knight, then bang, rook to d7, forks both the bishop on b7 and the king. That would be game over. So instead here, Boris Spassky, he doesn't take the knight right away. He actually takes the pawn on the e4 square with the bishop. A beautiful move. The idea behind this is if you want to take the knight, you are going to lose the bishop. So this way, Boris wins an extra pawn in the process. Bishop takes e4, rook takes, then king takes f7. And now here, suddenly we find ourselves in another fascinating Bobby Fischer endgame. Bobby Fischer has those 2 rooks. Black has the rook and the bishop. On paper, that is much better, but black also has, number 1 extra pawn, and number 2, those pawns on the queen side are connected pass pawns. So here, the battle lines are being drawn. Bobby Fischer has to show his 2 rooks are stronger than the rook and the bishop of black. Meanwhile, Boris Spassky has to find a way to force those pawns down the board as quickly as humanly possible in this game. Now here, Bobby, the move is rook d7, giving the king a check, forcing king to f6. Then he goes rook b7, eyeing that b5 pawn with the rook. Bobby trying to force through something like b4, at which point these pawns will no longer be on the same file. They are definitely strongest on the same file with the most potential. So if black is forced to go, say, b4, that would be massively to Bobby Fischer's benefit. Now, instead of that, here, Boris Spassky, being an endgame virtuoso, he goes rook to a1, hitting the king, forcing the king to go to the h2 square. Now, king h2 on the board, and bishop d6. Again, Boris Spassky finding some excellent moves, developing his pieces with tempo and putting pressure on the white king. Now, Bobby, g3 is the move. Very good defensive move. And now Boris Spassky finds a way to get his pawns rolling in this Ruy Lopez game. b4. Now, I just said this move would be to Bobby Fischer's benefit. However, here, the pawns are supported by the bishop on d6. His rook is a little more active, and perhaps Boris Spassky can get some counterplay going. Now, from here, Bobby Fischer, one of his biggest priorities is getting his king into the game. His route for the king is going to be king g2, then f3, then e2, and from there, he can reevaluate based on what he needs to do to stop those pawns on the queen side. So, king g2 for Bobby Fischer. Now, Boris, h5, expanding on the queen side, or on the king side. Very good idea. And here, Boris Spassky, demonstrating his knowledge of the endgame, he expands on the king side with the move h5, a brilliant idea. It's very, very simple. If white ever goes g4, trying to gain more space on the king side, then Boris is going to knock off that pawn on g4, trading the h-pawns, and that will make his defensive task a little bit easier in this game. Now Bobby, he ignores the idea, rook b6, pinning the bishop to the king. Of course, Boris has to respect that threat. He goes rook d1 defending, and then Bobby Fischer, king to f3, bringing his king further into the game. His idea may be king e2 next, further centralizing the king and hitting the rook on the d1 square with tempo. Now Boris, king to f7, getting his king out of the pin of the rook with the bishop, and then king e2 for Bobby Fischer, again showing his idea. Now rook d5 defends the rook, and here Bobby Fischer, he starts to take over in this game with a series of very, very precise moves. First of all, f4, expanding on the king side. Now, Bobby's idea is very simple. He has that 3 versus 2 pawn majority on the king side, those 3 pawns for white versus those 2 pawns for black, and therefore Bobby has to get his pawns rolling sooner or later, and now is the time. Here, Boris goes g6, trying to defend, trying to stay safe and solid, but Bobby is not done. g4, he's trying to create a pass pawn on the king side. He wants to go f5 at some point, at which point he will get what he wants. Now here, Boris Spassky takes on g4, Bobby takes back, and then a very committal move from Boris Spassky in this Ruy Lopez endgame. He goes for the move g5, try to lock down the king side. Now, Bobby has a choice. He can take on g5, however, that would weaken his king side a little bit. He'd have double pawns on the g-file, and beyond that, it would be really hard to push his g-pawn down the board with that black rook blockading it on g5. So with that in mind, he plays the much stronger idea, f5, expanding on the king side, keeping both of his pawns alive. And now, in the future, that pawn on the g5 square could be weak. For example, Bobby could go rook to e6, then rook g6, and finally taking the pawn on the g5 square. So that is Bobby's idea here. Now, Boris Spassky here, he goes bishop e5, trying to cut off the rook from accessing the e6 square. Not a bad idea at all. And from here, the bishop may go to, say, d4 or c3, trying to further defend those pawns on the queen side. Now Bobby, rook b5, pressuring the pawns, and beyond that, he is setting up a beautiful idea. Rook takes b4. The idea is if the pawn takes, the rook is hanging on the d5 square. That would win a pawn outright. And here, Boris Spassky, he misses the idea. He goes king to f6 in this Ruy Lopez endgame, but he misses the idea of rook e takes b4. Bobby Fischer shocked the chess world with this beautiful idea in the endgame. Now black, if he takes on b4, rook takes d5 is going to basically win the game on the spot. There is just too much of a material imbalance. So instead, bishop d4 is the only thing Boris Spassky can do, trying to defend. He's now got that bishop supported by the pawn. These two pieces support each other permanently, and black may be able to defend. All right, here, Bobby, with those 2 rooks on the queen side, he goes rook to b6, hitting that king on the f6 square. Now, king e5 for Boris, and then an absolutely brilliant idea by Bobby Fischer. I cannot tell you how brilliant this move was. King to f3. This move may look simple, but it has a diabolical threat. One of the most dangerous ideas you will ever see in chess. He's simply threatening rook to e6, and from there, the king will be out of squares. It can't go back. It can't go forward. That would be checkmate in one move. I mean, what a disrespectful idea by Bobby Fischer, threatening to checkmate Boris in one move in the endgame in the World Championship match. All right, don't freak out yet. Boris sees the idea. He goes rook d8. Giving his king a square. Now, if Bobby does go rook to e6, of course, king d5 is possible. It's not going to be the end of the game. However, here, Bobby, rook b8, offering the trade of rooks. If one pair of rooks gets traded off, that material imbalance of the rook versus the bishop is going to mean that much more. It's going to be that much harder for black to defend. And now, I got to point out the fact here. This rook on b4 by Bobby is technically hanging. However, if black takes it, then the move is rook takes d8, and again, Bobby gets what he wants, the rook versus the bishop endgame, so Boris can't allow that. Here, rook d7 is the move, again, trying to get out of the way of the attack, and finally, Bobby finally gets his rook out of that hanging position on b4. He goes rook 4, b7, offering yet again a trade of rooks. Here, Boris declines, rook d6. Now, rook b6 from Bobby. Again, he insists, rook d7, and then here, rook to g6. Finally, we're seeing the rook capitalizing on that key move f5 earlier, keeping these pawns alive. Now he's going to win the pawn on the g5 square. This is not looking good for Boris Spassky here in this Ruy Lopez game. All right, king d5 for black. Then Bobby just takes the pawn on the g5 square. Boris tries to defend bishop e5, but it is too little too late. Here, Bobby, f6. He starts the march of the pawn. Of course, the bishop on the e5 square is being pinned to the king. The bishop cannot move. King d4 for Boris. But then the final move for Bobby Fischer, an absolute stunner. This one, yet again, shocked the chess commentators and the chess world. Rook to b1. And after this move, Boris resigned on the spot. The idea, of course, he wants to go rook d1, skewering the king and the rook. For example, if black wastes a move, say c4, the idea, rook d1, the king has to move, then you lose the rook. Of course, black has different ways of getting out of that threat, but overall, Bobby Fischer's advantage is too much. He has the simple plan of pushing that pawn down the board, promoted to a queen, and here Boris Spassky has had enough. He resigns to Bobby Fischer and his brilliant Ruy Lopez opening. All right, that last game with Bobby Fischer and the Ruy Lopez was incredible, but this one, in my opinion, is even better. Here in this game, Bobby Fischer plays a showstopper strategy that is going to shock you, I guarantee it. Now, of course, here Bobby opens with the Ruy Lopez opening. He's playing as white. And here in this game, the year is 1992. Bobby Fischer's opponent is Svetozar Gligoric in a training match. Here, Gligoric goes for the closed Ruy Lopez, starting with the move a6. The first few moves are the same as in the last game. Black challenges the pawn, white castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and finally d6, getting that sturdy pawn center in the middle of the board. Now, Bobby Fischer goes for the main line with c3, and then after castles, h3, guarding the g4 square and setting up that d4 break, trying to gain control of the center. Now, here in the last game, of course, we saw Spassky go for that idea with knight to b8, the Breyer variation, an old favorite of Magnus Carlsen, actually. However, in this game in the Ruy Lopez, Gligoric goes for a different idea, an incredibly strong and popular system. That is the Zaitsev variation, starting with the move bishop b7. Now, the Zaitsev can be reached via bishop b7 or a very fast rook to e8. They are going to transpose. Now here, in contrast to the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez, black's idea here in the Zaitsev is to put immediate pressure on white's center, particularly the e4 pawn. Here's how it works out. White goes d4, then black goes rook to e8. The idea, he wants to go bishop f8, then both the rook on the e8 square and that bishop on b7 are putting pressure on the pawn on e4, not to mention the knight. Here, if white goes knight d2, black's going to be in time to go bishop to f8, stopping the knight f1 to knight g3 idea, because if white does that, he's going to lose the pawn on the e4 square. Now, I do want to mention, in this game, before going knight d2 in this position here, Bobby inserts an intermediate move. He goes knight to g5. This is a very cute little move. The idea is you are threatening bishop takes f7, winning the rook on the e8 square. So here, black is forced to go rook to e8, retreating the rook. And now here, white's knight on the g5 square is misplaced. At some point, black can go h6, knocking it back. So here, Bobby goes knight to f3, retreating the knight, and then Gligoric goes rook to e8 again. Now, if white wants a draw, he can actually go knight f5, forcing rook to e8, then knight to f3, and rook e8 again is basically a draw in his position. However, Bobby doesn't go for that. He goes back to the main line with the move knight d2. And the whole point of going knight g5 here in this position, then back to f3, was basically just messing with his opponent. He's just playing with his food here. He's got a little Gligoric dish, and he's just moving his food around, playing with it for a little bit. Now here, of course, black goes bishop to f8. This is the key idea in the Zaitsev variation. And here, it's very important to note that knight to f1 does not work for white. White cannot go knight f1, then knight g3, as in the Breyer variation, as we saw in the last game. And here's why. Real fast, if white goes knight to f1, then black wins a pawn with e takes, and then the key move knight to a5. This is the key move, opening up the line of attack with the bishop. Now black has the bishop, the knight, and the rook all piling down on e4. And if white doesn't want to lose that light squared bishop, he has to go bishop c2, but then black jumps in with the knight and takes the pawn. So this is the key idea of the Zaitsev. You stop that knight to f1, then knight g3 maneuver that we saw in the Breyer variation. Now, the problem with this variation, or not the problem, more the drawback compared to the Breyer, is that knight on the c6 square. It is a little bit misplaced. For example, in the Breyer, the knight goes to b8, then d7, a much better square where it doesn't block the c pawn from entering the game. Now here, Bobby Fischer, in the Zaitsev variation on the white side of the Ruy Lopez, he has a wide variety of plans that he can choose from. Some of the most popular ideas in general are going to be a4, that is the absolute main line. There's also the cute idea of a3, and several world champions, including Vichy and Nod, are big fans of this move, the idea being you open up that a2 square as a retreat square for the bishop, and maybe you want to go b4 in the future. Now, instead of those a-pawn ideas, here Bobby goes for a completely different idea that we haven't seen before in this video series. Here, he goes d5, gaining space in the center and knocking back that knight off the c6 square. Now, this is a very strong idea. It leads to more of a closed center and more of a slow positional game. But as we're going to see, Bobby has an incredible attacking idea that he's going to unleash in just a few moves. Here, the knight has to retreat. Where's he going to go? There are a few options. For example, knight to a5 is possible in the spirit of the Gligoric variation. But the problem with that is after bishop c2, white's going to have that b4 idea, getting space on the queen side, knocking back the knight. So with that in mind, knight a5, not really the best idea. There are other squares like knight a7 and knight e7, but they're also quite a bit weaker. Instead here, black goes for the main idea, that Breyer move, knight to b8. The idea behind this move is very simple. The knight's rerouting to the better square on d7. It's opening up the bishop, entering the game. And black is going to follow up with the move c6 at some point, trying to chop down at white's strong pawn center on the d5 and the e4 squares here. So now, Bobby Fischer, what's he going to do? He continues his plan, knight to f1, a very, very good move. From here, the knight can go to the g3 or the e3 squares, eyeing squares like f5 and d5. Of course, if black goes c6 at some point, white is going to respond d takes c6, and at that point, the d5 square is going to be opened up for one of his knights if he wants it. So, knight to f1, very good multi-purpose move. Now, black goes knight d7 in the spirit of the Breyer variation. And here we reach a critical crossroads in this game. Now, there are a lot of so-called normal-looking moves in this variation. For example, knight to g3 is very good, eyeing the f5 square. White also has the idea of knight to h2, an undeveloping move. The idea is you want to go knight to g4, trying to challenge that knight on the f6 square. And if you can do that, you increase your control over the d5 square, which will be opened up in the near future. Now, instead of those ideas, here Bobby unleashes an absolutely brilliant idea, g4, expanding on the king side, potentially even threatening g5 in the future. Now, this is not technically the strongest move here. Bobby knows that, but he's not trying to play the so-called strongest move. What he's trying to do here is get a unique position where he's exerting maximum pressure on his opponent, both over the board and from a psychological standpoint. Now, black, what is he supposed to do about this incredible threat of, say, g5, also potentially knight to g3, then f5, with the knight being supported by the pawn? Well, he has a few different ideas, but first of all, the main idea in this position, which is going to be c6, simply does not work here, and I want to show you why. It's an incredible idea by Bobby Fischer. If black goes for c6, the standard idea in the Zaitsev variation of the Ruy Lopez when white goes d5, then Bobby Fischer has the brilliant move g5, deflecting the knight. Then you actually go g6, freeing up the g5 square for the knight. For example, if black takes, you can take on c6, and then Bobby Fischer's idea would be knight to g5, overloading the pawn on the f7 square, and there's very little black can do to stop all of these threats. So, going back here to move 16, what else should black be doing? In the game, he finds the best move, knight to c5. Very good move by Gligoric in this Zaitsev variation of the Ruy Lopez. Here, of course, if Bobby wants to keep that light-squared bishop alive and defend the pawn on e4, there's only one move that does it. Bishop c2. Bobby, of course, finds it. And now here, with that bishop off this diagonal hitting the king, black can finally go c6. This is the best move, and it is what Gligoric plays in the game. Now from here, black's idea simply was to chop down on that pawn on d5, and instead if white takes it, then black is going to have immediate pressure on that pawn on e4 with both the knights and the bishop. Of course, the bishop being opened up on this diagonal if these two pawns fall. Now, Bobby, what's he going to do about this threat? He starts by expanding on the queen side with the move b4. A very powerful idea. We've seen this idea before in this video series in Game 1 versus Boris Spassky. It's very, very strong in a lot of lines in the closed Ruy Lopez. Now here, the knight is driven back. Knight c d7 is the move. Now Bobby takes on c6, forking both the bishop and the knight. Of course, bishop takes c6 is the only move in response. Now from here, this Ruy Lopez position is relatively level. However, Bobby Fischer has exactly what he wants here. He continues knight to g3, eyeing the f5 and the h5 squares with the knight. These two knights here are just wonderfully placed. Now, black goes knight to b6 in the game. A good move by Gligoric, trying to increase control over the d5 square. We see this kind of idea of knight b6 a lot in the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. Of course, Bobby Fischer being a huge Najdorf expert, that's pretty much the only opening he played against 1e4 or so. Bobby was likely very familiar with this idea, trying to gain control over that d5 square. Now here, Bobby, he has a few different ideas. In the game, he goes bishop b3, bringing the bishop back to the b3 square, exerting more pressure on this diagonal, especially on that pawn on f7 and on the king on the g8 square. So very interesting idea. Now, in the game, Gligoric plays a slightly inaccurate move, rook to c8. Now, this is a very standard idea in the closed variation of the Ruy Lopez. However, here it's a little bit slow. Instead, black had to seek immediate counterplay with the move a5. And here, Bobby Fischer, he is going to punish Gligoric's small inaccuracy with a series of absolutely brilliant moves. It's absolutely stunning that someone could find all of these moves so fast, so perfectly, all the way back in the year 1992. Now, of course, the knight has to retreat. The only square is going to be d7. For example, h5 is covered by the knight. Bobby has all of these squares covered. So, knight d7 in the game. Now, what is Bobby's idea? Well, he's making full use of the fact that the bishop is on b3 instead of c2. So now his main idea is to increase pressure on that f7 pawn as quickly as humanly possible. Here he finds the best idea, knight to h2. Kind of a strange-looking move if you're a beginner or if you haven't studied the Ruy Lopez. However, if you're an experienced player, you're going to know what's coming next. Here, black goes bishop b7, a solid move, trying to increase pressure on the c3 pawn with the rook. However, Bobby is just in time. He plays a move that is both defensive and offensive at the exact same time. Very typical for Bobby Fischer's games. Here, queen to f3, a brilliant move in this Ruy Lopez game, both defending the c3 pawn and attacking f7 at the same time. Of course, now Bobby is threatening checkmate in two moves. For example, a black wastes a move, say a5, then bang, queen takes f7, and then queen to g8 is going to be checkmate. Black has to respond to that immediately in this game. So, in the game, what's he supposed to do? Well, Gligoric finds a very interesting idea in this Ruy Lopez game, knight to c4, trying to block the bishop on the b3 square. Now, of course, if white takes, he's giving up his precious light-squared Ruy Lopez bishop. He can't do that. So instead, Bobby just increases the pressure. Knight to g4, a knight jumping into the game. He may even be threatening knight to h6 or knight to f6 ideas in the future. So stick around to see if that's going to be an idea in this game. Now here, Gligoric, he is under so much pressure in this position. What's he supposed to do? Well, he starts to crack a little bit. He plays a very weak idea, rook to e6. Now, the idea behind this move, first of all, trying to guard the 6th rank. He's trying to guard against the idea of those knight to f6 or knight to h6 sacrificial ideas. However, beyond that, he's also trying to cut off the bishop on this diagonal, trying to reduce the pressure against the king. However, Bobby doesn't mind. He just plays another very strong idea, bishop to e3. By far the best move, but not an obvious one at all. First of all, the obvious idea is that black takes the bishop on the e3 square. That dark-squared bishop isn't doing very much in this position. White can just take back with the queen. Then he's going to have that open attack with the bishop on the rook. And white's position is going to be absolutely fantastic. Black giving up maybe his best minor piece in this position. So instead of knight takes e3, what else should black be doing? Well, perhaps the best move is knight d to b6, try to further reinforce that knight on the c4 square. However, instead of that, he plays a very weak move, bishop to e7. Now, this move looks very logical in this closed Ruy Lopez position. Of course, black increasing the pressure on that pawn on the g5 square. However, this just plays right into Bobby Fischer's hands. He saw this coming a mile away, and here he just slowly increases the pressure with the move h4, defending the pawn on the g5 square. And beyond that, he's also setting up future ideas based on h5, and then either h5 or g6, trying to blow open black's king side. So Bobby, he's got a flair for attacking chess. He's marching these h-pawns and g-pawns down the board. It's going to be very interesting to see how he continues the attack in this game. Now from here, black retreats the knight, knight to f8. A pretty typical defensive resource in a lot of positions. He's trying to bring his knight closer to the defense of the king side. So not a bad move at all. But here, Bobby Fischer, he jumps in with his knight, knight to f5, finally bringing in his g3 knight to the key f5 square in the Ruy Lopez. Now, this is a very standard idea in this chess opening. The knight on f5 is incredibly strong. It's eyeing the e7 bishop, the g7 square. It maybe even threaten to sacrifice itself on the h6 square later in the game. So, let's see how this plays out. Queen to e8 from Gligoric. Basically a waiting move. There's not a whole lot that Gligoric can do productively in this position. He just has to sit back and wait and hope that Bobby Fischer isn't able to crash through on the king side. Now here in this position, Bobby again has a variety of ideas that he could do. For example, now h5 is actually very playable. Of course, the queen being on e8, it no longer eyes that g5 pawn with the bishop. Therefore, h5 is possible as the g5 pawn is sufficiently defended. However, Bobby, he does not want to do that. That is too one-dimensional. Bobby is a very universal player. He likes to attack all over the board, especially in the closed Ruy Lopez. So with that in mind, here he opens up a second line of attack on the queen side. A fantastic move, a4. The threat here is very simple. He wants to go a takes b5, and then he's going to have this open a-file for the rook. He may even infiltrate on the a7 square, putting pressure on that bishop on b7. So there's a very important principle in chess called the principle of two weaknesses. Oftentimes your opponent can defend if he only has one weakness. However, if you can open up a second line of attack and attack on either both sides of the board or attack multiple pawns or multiple squares, that can be a lot more difficult for your opponent to defend against. And of course, Bobby is well aware of this principle. Now in the game, how does black try to relieve the pressure? Well, he starts by taking the bishop on the e3 square. Not a bad idea, but it doesn't do a whole lot to help him. Here, Bobby Fischer recaptures with the e-rook. Rook takes e3, and now the rook is actually active on the third rank. It also defends that pawn on the c3 square. Maybe it's going to swing over to the king side later in the game, so this only seems to help white here. Now Gligoric continues, knight g6. Continuing the rerouting process of that knight, trying to bring it to a better square. And he's also putting some pressure on the pawn on h4, so Bobby is going to have to watch that closely. However, there's no immediate threat, and here Bobby, he opens up that second line of attack on the queen side. He starts with taking on b5. 8 takes b5. Now, queen takes b5 is technically playable, but it's very, very weak. It's bringing the queen further away from the defense of the king, so instead, he takes back with the a-pawn. 8 takes b5. But then Bobby, he jumps in with his a-rook in this Ruy Lopez position, rook to a7, putting pressure on that bishop on b7. Now, of course, black is going to have to respond to that. In the game, he goes rook to c7, maybe the best move. It does defend the bishop, but it also defends the king side along the 7th rank, so not a bad idea at all. But here, Bobby, he sees the big problem with this move. Right now, the bishop is actually pinned to the rook. For example, if the bishop moves anywhere, say to c6 or c8, the rook on the c7 square is going to fall. For that reason here, Bobby, he increases the pressure. Bishop d5. Bobby Fischer just playing with his food here. He doesn't take the rook on the e6 square. Instead, he threatens rook takes b7, winning a whole piece. Of course, winning a piece much better than winning a rook. Now here, black, he takes on d5, bishop takes d5, giving up the rook on the c7 square. That is much better than losing a whole piece. But now, after rook takes c7, Bobby Fischer is up the exchange. He has the whole extra rook versus the bishop of black. And black's bishop, to be honest, not doing a whole lot in this position, being attacked by the e-pawn. It has to go somewhere. In the game, he goes bishop c4. But now look at this position. I mean, let's just slow down and pause here and appreciate the brilliance of Bobby Fischer. Literally all of his pieces are on better squares than his opponent. The rook slicing across the 7th rank. The 2 knights on f5 and g4 wonderfully placed, threatening the g7 pawn, threatening various knight to h6 and knight f6 ideas. The queen lining up with the rook on the f7 square, and the other rook ready to pounce along the 3rd rank, swinging over to g3 or h3 potentially. It's just fascinating how Bobby always gets these marvelous positions in his games. Now, of course, here it is Bobby Fischer's turn to move. How does he increase the pressure in this game? Well, he finds a brilliant idea, h5, immediately hitting the knight. Now, there is a hidden idea behind this move. If the knight moves, it is effectively game over, lights out. Here, for example, I have to show you this variation. If black didn't go knight to f8 in this game, that looks like the most natural move at first glance. Here, Bobby has an unbelievable idea, basically forcing checkmate in a few moves. You start by taking the bishop on the e7 square. Rook takes e7. Now, of course, if queen takes, knight takes wins the queen. Therefore, rook takes is basically the only logical-looking move. But here, instead of regaining the rook, you jump in with the knight to the f6 square, forking the queen and the king. Of course, if you want to keep the queen on the board, the only move is g takes f6. But then here, Bobby would have one of the most beautiful checkmates of all time, knight to h6, forcing the king to move, king to h8, and then queen takes f6. The knight guards the g8 square, the queen guards everything else, and that would be game over. So, way back in this position right here, the knight cannot retreat. That knight to f6 idea is just too strong, is too devastating. So here, what can black do? Well, Gligoric is forced to give up the knight on the g6 square. He takes the pawn on g5. Now Bobby, he just takes the knight on g6. H takes g6. And here, of course, you cannot allow g takes f7 ideas. That would be devastating. Therefore, black has to respond immediately. There is no time to take the rook on the e3 square. So, rook takes g6, but now Bobby, he ignores the threat against the rook on the e3 square. Instead, queen to h3, very, very strong idea. Now, of course, it may look like that rook on the e3 square is hanging, but it is not. If black takes the rook on e3, then the move, the winning idea, knight to e7, forking both the king and the rook on the g6 square. I mean, that is going to be too much pressure. So, black cannot take on e3 yet. Instead, in the game, h6 is the move, trying to decrease some of the pressure on the h-file, trying to reinforce that bishop on the g5 square. So, good idea. But here, Bobby, he finally completes the idea of that rook lift that we saw earlier in the game. Rook to g3. Again, just increasing the pressure with all of his pieces. And here, Gligoric, he finally cracks. He plays the move king to h7. This turns out to be a fatal mistake. Here, Bobby, he doesn't find the winning idea on the spot, but there are just a number of unbelievable sacrifices. I do want to at least point them out. One idea, knight takes h6. The other idea, knight to f6. And the third brilliant move here, rook takes c4. You can investigate all of these ideas in your own games on your own, but trust me, all of those moves are absolutely astonishing. I highly recommend looking into them. Now, instead, queen to h5 on the board by Bobby Fischer. He sees no reason to go for a complicated variation when he's so far ahead, when he's so in control of the game. Now, Glgoric, he's a resourceful player. He's a very strong grandmaster. And he finds the best move to get counterplay. Queen to a8, swinging the queen over and eyeing the e4 pawn with the queen. Now, Bobby, there's no really good way to defend the pawn. Instead, he retreats the knight, the g knight, back to the e3 square. Knight g to e3, just preemptively defending the knight on the f5 square in case of queen takes e4. And that is what happens. Queen takes e4. Now here, Bobby takes the bishop on the c4 square. Knight takes c4. And black takes the knight on f5. Queen takes f5. Now Bobby retreats the knight, knight to e3. Again, Bobby Fischer still being up, the full rook in this position. Yes, black has 3 pawns for the rook, but Bobby Fischer's position is just so dominant here. Here, the knight is attacking the queen retreats, and then Bobby retreats the queen to f3, again, further increasing the pressure on black's weakest square, the f7 square. Now here, black goes bishop f4, offering the trade of rooks. Bobby accepts. Rook takes g6, queen takes, and then Bobby jumps in with the queen to g4, offering the queen trade. If the queens come flying off the board, Bobby's going to have the knight and the rook versus the bishop. That is going to be way too much material. Black's pawns are going to be gobbled up in no time. So here, Gligoric, he plays one last-ditch effort to try and get counterplay. Queen to b1, hitting the king on the g1 square. Now, if Bobby were to go king g2, then black may have some counterplay with the idea of bishop takes e3. Then after f takes, the second rank is opened up, and maybe queen c2, hitting the king on the g2 square, would give counterplay. But instead, Bobby, he's in complete control. He plays a devastating move, knight to f1. Brilliant idea, just blocking the check. And now it is almost impossible to defend against the threat of rook to f7. If the black king retreats to king g8 trying to defend, then the idea for white is going to be rook to c8, hitting the king, forcing the king back to the h7 square, and then rook to f7, again hitting the pawn. And for that reason, there is nothing black can do here to defend, and Gligoric resigns on the spot to Bobby Fischer and his unbelievable play in this Ruy Lopez opening. All right, diving into our third game, this one is Bobby Fischer versus Paul Brandts from a Manhattan Blitz tournament in 1971, and this game was explosive. Here, Bobby Fischer, as usual, opens with the Ruy Lopez opening with the move bishop b5, and again, we head for that closed variation of the Ruy Lopez. This was all the rage back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. So black, of course, bishop b7, rook e1, e5, bishop b3, and finally d6 for black. Now again, Bobby Fischer heads for the main line with c3 and then h3, intending d4 next. Now in the last two games, we saw the Breyer variation with knight to b8. We saw the Zaitsev with bishop b7, then rook e8 and bishop f8. In this game, black is going to go for one of the oldest and most solid lines against the Ruy Lopez opening. That is the Gligoric variation with the move knight to a5. Now, the idea behind this move is incredibly simple. Here, first of all, black is pressuring the bishop on the b3 square. That is that precious Ruy Lopez light squared bishop. You have to keep it alive. And the only good square is bishop c2. So, after Bobby retreats the bishop, then black is going to go c5, expanding on the queen side. Now, if white ever goes d4, as Bobby did in the game here, d4 immediately on move 11 in the Ruy Lopez, your black's always going to have the option of taking on d4, and that will open up the c-file for him and give him a little bit of counterplay. And besides that, getting rid of those pawns on the c-file will make his defensive task a little bit easier. Now, the one problem with the Gligoric variation, of course, is that knight on the a5 square. It is out of play, and it really doesn't have a good square. For example, if the knight ever goes back to c6, then Bobby Fischer is going to have the idea of d5, knocking it back once again. And if it stays on a5 here, white's always going to have the idea of b4 at some point, trying to expand on the queen side, or even a4, intending a takes b5, and again, opening up the line of attack of the rook on the knight. So overall here, black is very solid, but that one piece on the a5 square, that knight, that is going to give him all sorts of problems in this game. Now here, of course, Paul Brandts has a wide variety of options, wide variety of moves he could play. In the game, he goes queen c7. That is the best move. It's the most flexible move. Just putting the queen on a very good square. From there, it does control the c-file. It does support the e5 pawn, and black's looking very solid. Now here, Bobby Fischer, knight d2, the standard idea in the Ruy Lopez. Perhaps he wants to go knight to f1, then g3, or perhaps he wants to do something else, depending on what black does. And here, this is the real critical position of the Gligoric variation of the Ruy Lopez. Black has to commit to a plan. His main ideas are c takes d4, trying to relieve some of the tension in the center, or perhaps rook d8, bishop e7, and finally the move that black played in the game, knight to c6. Now, this is a very committal move. Here, black is trying to get his knight back into the game, and that makes a lot of sense. However, the drawback is Bobby Fischer can go d5 immediately, gaining space in the center with a gain of tempo on the knight. And that is what Bobby does here. d5 is by far the strongest move. To be honest, there are a lot of variations where white goes d5, even when black doesn't go knight to c6. So, for example, there are a lot of lines where black will say, go rook d8, and then will white go d5, even without black going knight to c6 first. So, d5 is a very good move in this variation, and it's even better when black has already committed the knight to the c6 square, as then Bobby is going to gain a tempo on the knight. So, fantastic move by Bobby. Now the knight has to go somewhere. Where is it going to go? Well, the two best squares are going to be knight to a5 and knight to d8. In the game, black goes knight d8, a very solid idea. The problem with knight to a5 is if black does that, then Bobby can go b3, taking control of the c4 square, and it's not really obvious what the knight is doing on that a5 square. So knight d8, maybe the most flexible move here for black. But now Bobby gets what he wants. He has a standard Ruy Lopez position with a very good space advantage in the center. And from here, he's going to be able to attack literally on both sides of the board. He can attack on the king side with ideas like knight f1, knight g3, maybe knight h2, queen to f3, or even f2, f4 ideas could be playable in the future. Now, on the other hand, he can also attack on the queen side, and the main way to do that is to immediately try and open the a file for his rook on the a1 square. And that is what Bobby does in the game. Here, a4, just expanding on the queen side, very solid move. Now, the threat, of course, if black wastes a move, say h6, Bobby's going to take on b5, then take the rook on the a8 square. So black, of course, has to respect that threat. What's he going to do? Well, the best move, and a move that Magnus Carlsen would likely play in this position, he plays this a lot in the closed Ruy Lopez, especially in the anti-martial lines. He would play rook b8. Now, this is the strongest idea, just defend the pawn on the b5 square with the rook. However, instead here, Paul Brandts goes for a different idea, queen to b8. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. Black here just defending the rook on the a8 square with the queen. So, if Bobby takes on b5, then takes the rook, black just takes back with the queen on the a8 square, and he does have control over the a file. However, of course, Bobby is not forced to do that, and he has a wide variety of playable ideas here. So, again, one idea is that standard Ruy Lopez maneuver, knight f1 to g3. However, in this game, Bobby has a completely different idea in mind, and it leads to absolutely explosive fireworks and tactical complications in the game. Here, Bobby, he goes for a pawn sacrifice with the move b4. I absolutely love this move. This ended up being one of my favorite Bobby Fischer games of all time. So here, this is a pawn sacrifice, and I'm going to show you why. In the game, Paul Brandts takes on b4, c takes b4, Bobby takes back, c takes b4. Now, the key idea, black's going to take on a4. That's what's played in the game. And now the queen has access to that pawn on the b4 square. So Bobby, way back in this position right here, when he played the move b4, he knew he was giving up that pawn on the b4 square potentially, and he did it anyway, but he had a very key idea in mind. So c takes, then b takes a4, then here in this position, Bobby, he takes back with the bishop. He doesn't take with the rook, as the rook would be a little bit misplaced on the a4 square. It would be vulnerable to different ideas like bishop d7. So instead, bishop takes a4 on the board, but this gives up the pawn on the b4 square, and black does take it in the game. Queen takes b4. All right, what is Bobby's idea? Well, he starts with the key move, bishop to a3, simply putting pressure on the queen on the b4 square. Of course, queen takes a4 is not possible, as that bishop is defended by the queen, so the queen does have to retreat somewhere. However, beyond that, Bobby also has a very sinister idea. I mean, just look at these bishops on the a3 and a4 squares slicing through the board. This bishop on a3 in particular does put a lot of pressure on that pawn on d6. And as we're going to see in this game, that is going to be Bobby's key idea. All right, now, the queen, of course, has to go somewhere. Where's it going to go? In the game, Paul Brandts goes for the best square for the queen, queen to b7. Now, this move is key because it also defends the bishop on the e7 square. For example, if black went to somewhere else, say queen b6 or queen b8, then white's going to have the key idea of knight takes e5, and if black takes the knight, then bang, bishop takes e7 will be possible. So, queen b7 defends the bishop. That way, if white goes knight takes e5 and then d takes, suddenly the bishop is being defended by the queen on the b7 square. So, Very, very good move by black. Now, Bobby Fischer in this position, what's he going to do to increase the pressure? Well, I just said the queen does defend the bishop on e7. However, I do want to point out, knight takes e5 is still possible. Real fast, here's the idea. If you take on e5 and black takes back, then the key move is d6. You win back the piece, and the complications heavily favor white. Now, instead of that, Bobby Fischer goes for a different idea, just as strong though. Knight to c4, just increasing the pressure on black's weakest pawn, that being the pawn on the d6 square. So now both the bishop and the knight do attack it. What's black going to do to defend? Well, black has a few different options, but none of them are very good. In the game, he goes knight to e8, trying to defend the pawn with the knight. Of course, there were alternatives. For example, queen b8 and queen c7 are also possible, but then white can simply bring out the rook to the b1 or c1 square, putting pressure on the queen, and that would be devastating. So, knight to e8, likely the best move, trying to defend the pawn with the knight. However, here Bobby, he has a very simple idea. He just takes the knight on the e8 square with the bishop. Now, this is a very committal move. Bobby obviously is parting ways with his precious light-squared bishop. That Ruy Lopez bishop is just so important for white's position. However, he has a key idea. After rook takes e8, of course, there is no knight on e8 defending the pawn. So now, bang, bishop takes d6 on the board, Bobby winning back the pawn. So now we have an even material position. And very importantly, black cannot take that bishop on the d6 square. For example, if he goes bishop takes d6, white regains the bishop with the knight, and then bang, you fork the rook on the e8 square and the queen on b7. So Bobby Fischer seeing all of this in advance, playing this brilliant chess here. So if bishop takes d6 isn't possible, how is black going to defend the pawn on the e5 square? In the game here, black goes for Ben Feingold's signature idea, f6, defending the e5 pawn with that f6 pawn. Now, Ben Feingold is a big fan of f6. If you don't believe me, just do a YouTube search for Ben Feingold f6, and you'll see right away how much he loves this move in almost any chess opening, but especially the closed Ruy Lopez. Now, Bobby Fischer is not done increasing the pressure. Rook b1, lining up the rook with the queen. Very solid idea. Now, where's the queen supposed to go? Well, again, black does not have a good choice of options. c6 is covered by the pawn, c7 covered by the bishop. If you go queen to d7, then knight to b6 forks both the rook on the a8 square and the queen on d7, so that's not possible. With that in mind, the only good square is queen to a7, but the queen does not inspire a lot of confidence on that square. Here, Bobby, again, further increasing the pressure, queen to a6, lining up the queen with the rook on the e8 square, that rook being undefended right now, and actually Bobby once again threatening checkmate essentially in two moves here. For example, a black wastes a move. It's kind of hard to waste a move here, but say bishop b7, then queen takes, and the only move is bishop to f8, and then queen takes f8 is checkmate. So black here under a lot of pressure after this early queen move by Bobby Fischer. Now, what's black going to do? In the game, he goes bishop d7, blocking the idea, very solid. But here, Bobby, queen to a3, rerouting the queen to the a3 square, supporting the bishop on d6, and also threatening bishop takes e7 immediately. Of course, now we have the bishop and the queen targeting the bishop on e7. Black's only defending it with the rook. The queen's defense of that e7 square is being blocked by black's bishop on d7. So again, it's amazing how in all of these games, Bobby managed to get so much pressure in the white side of the Ruy Lopez. It's hard to believe how he does it every single time. All right, here, Paul Brandts finds the best move for black, both a defensive move and an offensive move, bishop b5. Very, very good. First of all, targeting the knight on the c4 square, that knight is now hanging. However, beyond that, he's also defending the bishop on e7 with the queen. Now it's being supported by the queen and the rook. So, what is Bobby going to do? First of all, he takes on e7 with the bishop. Bishop takes e7, and black takes back with the queen. Queen takes e7. Now, this turns out to be a slightly inaccurate move. Instead, rook takes e7 may have been a little bit stronger, but then Bobby just goes rook e to c1, defending the knight, and he's got a great game. Instead, queen takes e7 on the board, offering a queen trade. Now, if Bobby did trade on e7 with, say, queen takes e7, then black would have a relatively okay game. He might even have a better endgame next to that protected passed pawn on the a6 square. Or not protected, but very strong passed pawn on the a6 square. Instead here, Bobby keeps the queens on the board with the absolute strongest move in the position. Knight to d6. A very, very good move. Now, this move is very ballsy. I mean, the queen on the a3 square is undefended, and that means the knight on d6 is technically pinned. So, Bobby jumping straight into a self-pin with the knight. He better know how to follow this up. Now here, what should black be doing? Well, the right idea, of course, is putting pressure on the pin piece immediately. And the best way to do that is either knight b7 or knight to f7. From there, threatening knight takes d6 with either knight move. Now, instead, black makes a waiting move, rook to b8. This turns out to be a very big mistake. Here, Paul Brandts had to immediately put pressure on that pinned knight on the d6 square. And this gives Bobby all the time he needs to increase the pressure. Here, rook to e3, a brilliant idea, both defensive and offensive. Here, the defensive idea is you are defending the queen on the a3 square, meaning the knight is no longer pinned. You are now threatening knight takes e8, as if the black queen takes on a3, the rook is defending. However, beyond that, this rook lift has aggressive intentions. Here, Bobby is eyeing that g3 square with the rook. If the knight moves to, say, h4 or h2, then Bobby may go rook to g3, threatening rook takes g7 in various lines. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Stick around to see that. All right, here, black finally goes knight to f7, trying to relieve the pressure, but this is a move too late. If black played this a move earlier, then knight takes e8 would not be possible, as the queen on the a3 square would hang. However, here, Bobby, he just takes the rook. Knight takes e8, the queen takes back, and here Bobby Fischer is up the exchange. He has that extra rook versus the extra bishop of black, and that gives Bobby a clear advantage in this game. All right, let's see how he increases the pressure. First of all, knight d2. Excellent move, freeing up the g3 square for the rook. Again, as we talked about, because black went f6, Ben Feingold's favorite move, now the g7 pawn is much weaker. Here, Bobby Fischer can get a rook on the g3 square and maybe a rook on c7. Then the pawn on f7 doesn't exist. It doesn't block the idea of rook takes g7, and white may have some sacrificial ideas on that g7 square. So, let's see what happens. Rook d8 from Paul Brandts, a defensive move, not really very good. The idea is he wants to go knight to d6, but this is just too little too late. Here, Bobby, rook c1, getting the rook to the open c-file, again eyeing the c7 square with the rook. Now knight d6, and Bobby continues with his idea, rook to c7, again lining up the rook with the g7 point. Now here, black, he goes queen to g6. And this turns out to be a critical mistake. His position is already pretty bad, but he had to find something else in this position here. The problem with queen g6 is it does nothing to stop Bobby Fischer's idea of rook to g3. In fact, it's just begging for Bobby to play that move, and Bobby does in the game. Rook g3, hitting the queen, and here was Paul Brandts' idea. He wants to go queen to h6, defending the g7 pawn with the queen from h6. However, there is a big problem with this move. It does nothing to stop the idea of rook takes g7, and Bobby Fischer, he's an aggressive player. He loves to sacrifice his pieces, especially if he can get an attack against the black king, and that is exactly what he does here. He simply goes for it with the move rook takes g7, a brilliant idea, giving up the two rooks, but in exchange, he wins a pawn. And more importantly, the black queen after queen takes g7 and then rook takes g7, then finally king takes. And here we reach sort of a middle game, end game type of position. What's the material? Well, white has the queen and the pawn versus the black bishop and rook. That is just way, way, way too much material. And as more and more pieces come off the board, that material advantage is going to be worth more and more. So here, Bobby just cleans up. He is just in the mood to destroy his opponent as quickly as possible. f3, defending the pawn on the e4 square. That means the knight is now free to move. King f7 from black. Bobby goes knight b3. Then king e7, black trying to defend. But the problem with this idea is the knight on d6 is now pinned to the king. Black moving his king intentionally into the pin, and Bobby is in the mood to punish this mistake. Here, knight c5, threatening knight to b7 ideas, and here black goes rook to c8, a critical mistake, removing the rook from the defense of the knight. And Bobby just jumps in, knight to b7, threatening knight takes d6. And here, the knights are going to come off the board. Black can't even defend the knight. For example, rook to d8 is not possible. Rook c6 is not possible. The pawn wins the rook. That means black is straight up losing the knight to the idea of queen takes d6. If black had just kept the rook on the d8 square, maybe he could go rook d7 defending and hitting the knight at the same time. But here, there is no defense to queen takes d6. And for that reason, in this position, Paul Brandts resigns on the spot to Bobby Fischer. Wow, what a game with that explosive idea of rook takes g7 in this position here by Bobby Fischer. All right, diving into our next game. This one is Bobby Fischer versus Herbert Seidman from the 1960 United States Championships. This was round number 6 of this tournament. Here, as usual, Bobby opens with his favorite Ruy Lopez opening. And this game was just unbelievable. I don't want to give away how it all went, but if you're a true Bobby Fischer fan, you already probably know a little bit of what's coming here. All right, in the game, black goes for the closed Ruy Lopez, starting with the move a6. But of course, this game's going to be a little bit different. Here, bishop b7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and black castles. Now, this move is inviting the Marshall attack if black wants it. The Marshall attack, of course, being where white goes c3, and black goes for an immediate d5. Now, this idea was not as popular during Bobby Fischer's reign as basically the #1 player in the world. Nowadays, it's super popular. Magnus Carlsen plays it a ton as black. It may even be his favorite opening as black against 1e4. But again, way back during Bobby Fischer's time, it wasn't as common. Here, Bobby goes h3, inviting black to go d6, at which point he will go h3, transposing back to the main lines of the closed Ruy Lopez. But here, black, he actually goes for the Marshall attack with the move d5. This is a very aggressive pawn sacrifice. The idea is you are giving up a pawn, that being the pawn on the e5 square, but in return, you get a vicious attack against the white king with very, very good compensation. Now here, of course, Bobby does take on d5. E takes d5 is the move. And now the main line for black starts with knight takes d5. At that point, white's going to win the pawn on e5, but black's going to go bishop d6, then queen to h4 later, getting a big attack against the white king. Now, in the game, none of that happened. Here, instead, black goes for the move e4 in this Ruy Lopez position. And Herbert Seidman's idea is to put pressure on the knight on the f3 square. However, of course, the drawback of this move is the knight on c6 is currently undefended. Here, Bobby, he has a choice of ideas. He could technically move the knight to, say, g5. He could also go d3 or d4, trying to get a normal-looking position, but Bobby is ready for a fight. He's not backing down from a challenge. Here he plays the best move, the strongest one, and the most combative idea, d takes c6, winning the knight on the c6 square. Now, of course, if black does anything other than e takes f3, he's going to get blown off the board. He has to regain the piece right away with the move e takes f3. And now here, Bobby, what's he going to do? The most obvious move, of course, is queen takes f3. That's what he plays in the game. However, I do want to point out there are other ideas that are technically a little bit stronger, including g3 and d4. So if you want to investigate those on your own, you can. But in the game, Bobby went queen takes f3, just regaining the pawn. Now, why is queen takes f3, more problematic move for white? Well, here, black has the very, very strong idea, bishop g4, developing the bishop with a gain of tempo on the white queen on the f3 square. I can't draw arrows on f3. Now, of course, the queen, it would be more comfortable way back on the d1 square. However, that is not possible as the bishop controls this whole diagonal here. So now the queen is forced to stay in the fight, forced to stay somewhere more in the center of the board. So where should the queen go? Well, let's see. If it goes to f4, that looks pretty logical. The problem with that is black goes bishop d6, hitting the queen again with another gain of tempo, and then the queen would have to go somewhere else. So instead, queen g3 on the board by Bobby Fischer, the best move. Now here, Herbert Seidman, all the same, goes bishop d6, developing the bishop to the better square, hitting the queen, also eyeing the h2 square in the future. That could be a very big deal later in this game. Now, if the queen was going to f4, it would have to move somewhere else right away. However, here, Bobby, because he went queen to e3 instead, he has an additional resource in this position. It's very committal, very risky, but also very, very strong if Bobby follows it up correctly with the precise moves. Here, he expands on the king side with the move f4, keeping his queen on the g3 square and blocking the attack of the bishop. Now, this f-pawn is now a fighting piece in this game. It does control a lot of squares. However, of course, it does weaken White's king side. This diagonal in particular being opened up. Now White has to follow up perfectly or he's going to be in a lot of trouble. Here, Herbert Seidman, he doesn't go for the classical martial attack move. That would be rook to e8, challenging White's rook on the e1 square. Instead, here, he goes for an absolutely insane-looking move, g5. All right, what is the idea of this move? First of all, Black is threatening bishop takes f4 right away. And if White takes the pawn on the g5 square, that is not possible as the pawn was pinned to the queen. Here, bishop takes g3, wins the queen and the entire game on the spot. So that was the idea. Putting pressure on the pinned piece, that being the pawn on the f4 square, being pinned by the bishop to the queen on g3. So with that in mind, what is Bobby's idea? Here he has two good moves, either d3 or d4, defending the pawn on f4 with the bishop. In the game, Bobby plays the stronger idea, d4. There's absolutely no reason not to advance the pawn 2 squares in this position, although there are some positions in other lines of the martial attack of the Ruy Lopez where d3 might be a better idea, but here, d4, by far the best move. Now, Black, what's he going to do to follow up? He goes king to h8. This turns out to be the strongest idea in the position. It's a very good multi-purpose defensive and offensive move in this martial attack of the Ruy Lopez. Here, Black, first of all, getting his king off the g-file. Of course, when the king was on g8, it was being lined up with the white queen on the g3 square, and that could pose significant problems later in the game. So, first of all, king h8, getting the king out of future attacks with the white queen. But beyond that, now the rook can also access the g8 square. If Black gets that move in, then the rook will be lining up with the queen. It'll be lining up with the pawn on the g2 square, and Black could have a lot of very dangerous threats. So, king to h8, fantastic move by Herbert Seidman. And now Bobby Fischer, he has a very big problem. How the heck do you complete development? I mean, look at these queenside pieces here. The bishop, the knight, and the rook all stuck on their original squares. There's no obvious way to get them into the game. For example, if White goes knight d2, that blocks the bishop. If he goes bishop d2, that blocks the knight. And the rook, how's it getting into the game? Well, Bobby manages to find a way to get his pieces rolling with an absolutely brilliant rook sacrifice. Rook to e5. Bobby is just giving up the rook on the spot, and this turns out to be unbelievably strong, not to mention brilliant. Here, the most obvious idea. If Black takes the rook on e5, say bishop takes e5, Bobby will just recapture with the pawn. And then in this position, he's going to be down the exchange. He's going to have the extra bishop in exchange for the rook for Black. But he will be up, let's see, 2 whole pawns. And he has these central pawns on d4 and e5 that are incredibly strong. The pawn on g5 is falling. And from there, Bobby's going to have a very, very easy plan of getting the rest of his pieces into the game. So, taking the rook on e5 is effectively suicide for Black here in this Ruy Lopez position. So, you can't do that. With that in mind, what should Black do? Well, Black takes on on f4 with the g-pawn, the best move. G takes f4. Now Bobby takes back with the bishop. And here again, Black has the option of going bishop takes e5. However, after bishop takes back, again, Bobby has more than enough compensation for the exchange. He's going to have the 2 pawns. The knight's going to be pinned on f6 to the king. He can always go queen to h4 or other ideas, piling up the pressure. That bishop on g4 is going to be loose. That's just not going to work. So this rook idea, rook to e5, blocking all of Black's pressure, and Black can't even take the rook without suffering massive consequences. So with that in mind, here, Herbert Seidman finds a different idea, knight to h5. Again, by far the best move. It's amazing how all the way back in the 1960s, these players play such unbelievably good chess. Of course, the idea here, first of all, the knight hitting both the bishop on f4 and the queen on g3. If the queen moves, then Black just takes the bishop, and perhaps then he can pick up the rook on the e5 square with a decent game. However, here, Bobby Fischer showing that he is truly not of this world. This man is from a different planet. He sees the chessboard unlike any other player has ever seen it in the history of the game. Here, he gives up the rook for a second time. The first time, of course, being the rook sacrifice on e5, which black sort of couldn't take without suffering consequences. But here, he goes in off the deep end once again. Rook takes h5. The second time in this game, he's sacrificing the same rook. All right, here's the idea. Black takes the rook on h5, and then Bobby Fischer, knight to d2, and suddenly look at this position. Okay, Bobby is down the exchange. He has the extra light squared bishop versus the extra rook of black. But beyond that, look at black's king, completely exposed. White's bishop's on fantastic squares. The knight coming into f3 or e4, and the rook on a1 has a very clear path sliding into the game on the f1 or perhaps the e1 squares. And beyond all that, of course, Bobby with those extra 2 pawns on the queen side, that gives him far better control of the center. Now from here, black goes rook to e8, a good move, perhaps intending rook to e2. This game's getting very, very intense, both sides trying to attack on the king side as fast as they can. Now Bobby, rook to f1, a fantastic idea, and more importantly, Bobby Fischer showing he wants to utterly destroy his opponent in this game. He believes in his chances. Here, instead of rook to f1, Bobby had the opportunity to simply go bishop takes d6, offering a queen trade after queen takes, then queen takes d6, and c takes d6. And yes, in the endgame, Bobby Fischer would have the clear advantage. He would likely clean up there anyway, but instead, Bobby's saying, I'm going to keep the queens on the board. I want to finish you right here in the middle game with the queens on. So, Bobby, man, the guts of this guy. All right, now, black, what's the idea? In the game, he lunges forward with the rook to the e2 square, rook to e2, setting up threats against the pawn on g2. However, this turns out to be a mistake, and it's only a mistake because Bobby finds another brilliant idea. Bishop to d1, hitting the rook, and if the rook moves, the bishop on the h5 square falls. Bobby Fischer skewering the rook on the e2 square. Brilliant idea. Of course, here, black does have some resources in the game. He finds the key move, rook takes d2, trying to win the knight. Now, if white takes the rook on the d2 square, then, of course, bishop takes g3 wins the queen. So the rook on d2 is not hanging here. So Bobby takes the bishop on h5. Bishop takes h5. And here in this position, Bobby has just a number of different dangerous ideas. The most dangerous, of course, being bishop to e5 check, hitting the king. So I do want to show you real fast. For example, if black does not play a good defensive move, let's say he takes that hanging pawn on the b2 square, then Bobby's going to lunge in with the bishop, bishop to e5. This is absolutely devastating, opening up the attack on the king, opening up the attack of the rook and the bishop on f7. I mean, it is going to be incredibly hard for black to defend here. So instead, black does not take the pawn. He plays a very good defensive move, f6, removing the attack of the pawn by the bishop and also blocking the e5 square with the pawn. So Ben Feingold's signature move, f6, turning out to be the key resource in this position. However, of course, Bobby is not done. Rook to e1 is his move in this position, setting up very dangerous threats on the e8 square. For example, simply rook to e8 is threatened, winning the queen in exchange for the rook and the bishop. So black's going to have to defend against that threat perfectly. Here in the game, he starts by capturing the bishop on the f4 square. Bishop takes f4, and Bobby just takes back with the queen. Queen takes f4. So far, so good. Now here, black's going to have to do something to defend against the threat of rook to e8, right? Well, in the game, he ignores the threat, he takes the pawn on b2, and this does nothing to stop Bobby Fischer's idea. Bobby lunges forward with the rook, rook to e8, and here black is forced to give up the queen in exchange for the rook and the bishop after the move rook takes e8. Now, here we are officially in the endgame. Let's do a material count. Bobby Fischer has the queen and an extra pawn, and meanwhile black has the 2 rooks. This means on paper the material is roughly equal. However, the key difference here is that the rooks are not coordinated well, black's king is incredibly vulnerable, and black's pawns, for example, on f6 and c7, are very, very weak, and if that pawn on c7 falls, then this c6 pawn is going to be a pass pawn threatening to promote on the c8 square. So here, with all of these factors taken into consideration, Bobby Fischer has a commanding lead in this endgame. All right, in this position, the best move is going to be queen takes f6, but Bobby is concerned about various back rank mating threats. So with that in mind, h3 is the move, giving the king a retreat square on h2 and stopping those ideas permanently. Now here, what does Seidman do? He expands on the queen side with the move b4, trying to break up white's pawns. However, this move is a little bit slow. Bobby takes on b4, then black takes with the rook, and now, of course, if black had the rook back on the b2 square, he would have various ideas like rook to e2, threatening just perpetual checks along the second rank, hitting the king over and over and over. But instead, that is not a possibility, at least not for a few more moves. And here, Bobby, he punishes this mistake immediately. Bobby the Punisher, queen takes f6, hitting the king. Now, the only move, of course, king to g8. And again, Bobby, queen g5, hitting the king to h8, and then queen to f4, both defending the pawn on d4 and threatening queen takes c7. Again, if that pawn on c7 falls, this c6 pawn will be a passer, and it will be just almost impossible for black to stop. All right, here, black goes rook to a4, threatening rook takes a2. However, this is just too slow. Queen to f7, hitting the rook on the e8 square. Black goes rook g8, and then queen takes c7 for Bobby Fischer. Now he has those double pass pawns, connected pass pawns on c6 and d4, but especially the one on the c6 square. Bobby's plan here is so simple. He just wants to move the queen with check, hitting the king, and then forcing through the pawn right away. Let's see how it works out. Black, rook takes a2, winning a pawn. Black now has that passed a pawn, but Bobby Fischer, he's sticking to his plan. Queen to e5. Now the only move is rook g7. Black plays it, then g4 for white, stopping any sort of rook takes g2 ideas in the future. So excellent move. Bobby not in a rush. Black goes h6, trying to give the king a retreat square on h7. But here Bobby, queen to b8, hitting the king with check. The rook retreats, blocking the check. And here Bobby Fischer, he plays one last brilliant move to seal the deal in this game. c7. Oh, such a good move. The idea being if the rook takes the queen, then the c-pawn takes back on the b8 square. For example, rook takes, c takes b8, promoting to a queen. Bobby Fischer will be up a queen versus the rook in the endgame. And for that reason, in this position right here, after c7, Hilbert Seidman resigns on the spot to Bobby Fischer and his unstoppable Ruy Lopez opening. All right, diving into our last game here. This is the last game of the video series. I may have saved the best for last. It is Bobby Fischer versus Viktor Korchnoi in the Ruy Lopez opening. You know it's going to be a good game when it's literally Bobby Fischer versus Viktor Korchnoi. All right, in the game, Viktor goes for the closed Ruy Lopez as usual. We're going to blitz through these first moves. You've seen them over and over. Knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles. Now here in the last game, Bobby went c3 and black responded with the Marshall attack. We're going to see a slightly different line in this game. So c3 from white, d6 from Viktor Korchnoi, and now instead of the standard idea, h3, here in this game, Bobby Fischer mixes things up. He goes for the line starting with the move 9d4. Now this move here is not nearly as popular as the main line starting with the move h3, just trying to guard the g4 square. Here, instead, after d4, the problem with this move is black can go for an immediate bishop g4, trying to put pressure on white's center. That is the strongest idea here, and that is exactly what Viktor Korchnoi does in this game. Bishop g4, bang. Now here, Viktor has a lot of pressure on white's center, especially that knight on the f3 square, the knight being pinned to the queen. So for example, if white is going to waste a move, let's say a3 here, the threat is going to be simply bishop takes f3, and then white has to make a decision. Do you recapture with the queen or the g-pawn? Taking with the g-pawn is not a fun move to make, but neither is queen takes f3, as then black can take on d4 with the pawn and then the knight, winning the pawn. So obviously, Bobby Fischer has to respect this idea. He has to defend the pawn on the d4 square somehow. So what are his options? Well, the two main moves in this position for white are going to be d5, closing down the center. Obviously, that would remove the threat of, say, e takes d4, that no longer being a possibility here. However, in the game, Bobby went for the other idea, bishop to e3. This move is also excellent. The advantage it has over d5 is it maintains all of the tension in the middle of the board. Here, those pawns are still on d4 and e4, and Bobby Fischer, being the better player, he knows if he can maintain more tension in the position, it's going to be more likely that his opponent makes a mistake and he can pounce on it. So, Bobby, excellent ideas so far in this game. Now here, Black has a wide variety of options. I do want to point out the only thing you cannot do here as Black is take the pawn on the e4 square. That pawn is taboo. You cannot take it. If Black goes knight takes e4, then the winning move for White is bishop d5, forking both the undefended knight on c6 and the undefended knight on the new e4 square. So, knight takes e4, not a possibility. Beyond that, Black has a wide variety of ideas here. There's a lot of modern theory as this line is relatively popular at the highest level. For example, Black can go bishop h5, knight to a5, even d5 here is a playable move. Instead of those moves in the game, Viktor Korchnoi goes for the move e takes d4, releasing some of the tension in the center. Now here, White takes back with the c-pawn. So far, so good. And now Viktor goes for a series of very strong moves. He starts with the idea knight to a5, pressuring that bishop on the b3 square. Of course, if Bobby Fischer wants to keep that Ruy Lopez bishop alive, he has to retreat it back to the c2 square, that being the best move and the standard idea in the Ruy Lopez opening. But here, this is Viktor's idea. Knight to c4, jumping in with the knight, and forking both the bishop on the e3 square and that pawn on b2. Now, if White wants to defend the pawn and keep that dark squared bishop alive, literally the only move he can do is bishop c1, and that is what Bobby does in the game. Bishop c1 on the board. Now, this is not a terrible move to make. However, it does undevelop the bishop, and White has to sort of re-coordinate his pieces here. So now, Viktor Korchnoi, how is he going to get counterplay? Of course, White has that perfect pawn center on d4 and e4. You cannot allow that to stand as Black. So here, he goes for the standard idea in the closed Ruy Lopez opening. He breaks on the queen side with the move c5, gaining space and also threatening the move c takes d4. If Black can get that move in, again, Black still has a lot of pressure on this knight on f3. That could actually be quite dangerous for White. So here, Bobby, he respects the idea. He goes b3, expanding a little bit on the queen side and more importantly, knocking off the knight from that c4 square. Now, this move is not without its drawbacks. One of the primary problems with this move is it does weaken this diagonal here, and Black may be able to exploit that. So, let's see what happens. In the game, Black goes knight to a5. Now, this move is a little bit weak. Instead, the stronger idea was knight to b6. Here's why Viktor Korchnoi's knight to a5 wasn't the strongest move here. In this position, Bobby Fischer just cuts off that knight almost permanently with the move d5. Very, very strong idea, very thematic for the Ruy Lopez. Simply cutting off that c6 square from the knight. Now the knight has no easy way of getting back into the game. Of course, the knight could theoretically go to b7, but then from b7, it has literally no other squares to reroute to. So this knight on a5 may be stuck on the edge of the board for a while now. Now here, what should Black be doing in this position? Well, his main idea for getting counterplay is going to be exploiting this diagonal here that White weakened with the move b3. So, Viktor, he spots this immediately. He goes for the move knight to d7, a very common idea in the closed Ruy Lopez. There's even a line, I believe it's called the Carrez variation, where Black does this on move 9. So, the idea here being knight d7, intending bishop f6, putting pressure on this rook on the a1 square and this diagonal in general. Beyond that, Black can also go knight to e5, and that knight on the e5 square will synergize perfectly with the bishop on f3, putting pressure on White's knight on the f3 square. So, Viktor, I can't emphasize enough how important this move knight d7 was for his position in this game. Now here, Bobby Fischer, he's still fighting for an advantage. He continues with the move knight d2, bringing in the other knight into the game and supporting the knight on the f3 square. Instead, bishop e2 may look like a better move, but the problem with this is the bishop isn't really doing a whole lot yet. Black can always challenge it with bishop f6, and beyond that, Black can also jump in immediately with the knight to the e5 square, putting pressure on the knight, and again, bishop b2 isn't doing a whole lot to help White's position. So instead, knight d2, a much better move from Bobby Fischer. Now here, Viktor Korchnoi, he continues with his plan. Bishop f6, pressuring the rook on the a1 square. Now Bobby goes rook b1, getting out of the attack. And here, Viktor Korchnoi, he has a lot of his pieces on very good squares. Of course, the knight rerouting d7, the bishop on f6, the bishop on g4. And now he really has to find a strong plan to get counterplay in this position beyond what he's already done. And he has a few ideas. For example, knight to e5 is very playable. Instead, he decides to expand on the queen side with the move c4. Now, this is a very interesting idea by Viktor Korchnoi. It's a very common thematic idea in the closed Ruy Lopez. Besides just gaining space and threatening c takes b3, black also frees up the c5 square for the knight. So perhaps Viktor wanting to go knight c5 instead of knight to e5 in this game. That would be a very interesting development. Now, how does Bobby Fischer deal with this? Well, he starts with the very key move h3, trying to put the question to the bishop, where do you want to go? Obviously, the bishop does not have a good retreat square on this diagonal, so the only options are bishop takes f3 and bishop h5. Now, real fast, if black does go bishop h5, that turns out to be a little bit weak, as white can follow up with the move g4, knocking back the bishop, then knight to f1, knight g3, and he's going to have a very strong initiative on the king side. So here, black is pretty much committed to giving up that bishop on the f3 square. That is what Viktor does in the game. He spots all of these threats. Bobby Fischer responds, knight takes f3. And now we have a major imbalance in the position. Bobby Fischer, of course, having that bishop pair. Meanwhile, black having that pawn majority on the queen side, which is already very far advanced. So here in this game, the battle lines are drawn. Bobby Fischer is going to be attacking on the king side, especially with his bishops and his knight on the f3 square. Meanwhile, black is going to be attacking on the queen side, trying to push this pawn majority down the board and put pressure on white's position. Now here in this position, Viktor Korchnoi takes on b3 with the pawn, c takes b3, Bobby recaptures back with the a-pawn. Of course, bishop takes b3 is possible, but Bobby has to keep that Ruy Lopez bishop alive at all costs, so a takes b3, clearly the better move. Now Viktor, queen c7, developing the queen. Bobby goes bishop e3, very solid idea. Perhaps intending bishop d4 at some point, trying to challenge black's strong dark squared bishop on the f6 square. Now, how does black deal with the threat? In the game, he plays a very committal move, bishop c3. Viktor Korchnoi launching his bishop deep into the enemy territory, hitting the rook of Bobby Fischer on the e1 square. All right, Bobby here, he has to deal with the threat. He has a few different ideas. One idea is bishop d2, blocking the threat, but Bobby didn't like that idea. Instead, he can move the rook to the e2 or the e1 or the f1 square defending. In the game, he goes rook to e2, very good move. Now he also has the rook defending the bishop on c2, and that could be important in many different lines, especially if black goes, say, rook a to c8 or rook f to c8, doubling up on the c-file with the queen and the rook. So this move could come in handy later in the game. Now here, black, he plays a very committal move once again, b4, locking down the queen side. This is a very gutsy decision by Viktor Korchnoi. Of course, the pawns are a lot less mobile, and it's going to be very hard for Viktor to get that move a5 to a4 in now. And it's going to be very hard for Viktor to get some sort of play going on the queen side with the a-pawn. For example, a5, then a4 is going to be a lot harder to achieve. White has that a4 square on lockdown currently. So, Bobby, this may be his opportunity to increase the pressure on the king side right away. In the game, he starts knight d4, moving forward with the knight, freeing up the f-pawn, also setting up knight to f5 ideas. If Bobby can get the knight to f5, Garry Kasparov once said the knight on f5 is a monster, it's worth at least a pawn, and that would definitely be true in this position. All right, here, black goes rook to e8, solid move by Viktor Korchnoi in this closed Ruy Lopez, but Bobby, he just continues with his plan. Knight to f5, bringing the knight in, threatening the g7 pawn, and here Bobby already has a lot of pressure on black's position. I mean, the g7 pawn is being threatened in certain lines, knight h6 may be a threat in certain lines. The knight also covering the d6 pawn, meaning the queen has to stay here defending that pawn for now. So now, what is black going to do to deal with this threat? The strongest idea may be g6. We may see this later in the game by Viktor Korchnoi. Instead, he starts knight b7, rerouting the knight. Perhaps his idea here is knight to c5, and then maybe a5 to a4. Now, this is a good idea in theory, but it is a little bit slow, and it gives Bobby more time to keep his attack going. Here, bishop d4 is the move. Bobby taking control of this long diagonal here, and because the bishop on c3 is being blocked by the bishop on d4, Bobby is actually threatening knight takes g7 or similar ideas here. So now black has to respond to the threat. If you take on d4 with the bishop, then queen takes d4, and suddenly white is threatening checkmate in one move. That does not solve the issue. Instead of black goes knight to f6, trying to block this diagonal. Then white's going to have various ideas like rook to c1, lining up the rook with the queen. That doesn't help either. Instead, Viktor Korchnoi goes for the strongest idea here, g6, defending the g-pawn by moving it forward one square to the g6 square. However, of course, the problem with this is it weakens the dark squares around the black king. Now, here, Bobby Fischer in the game goes knight to h6, a very solid idea. However, if you really want to go deep into this position, I highly recommend looking into the move rook to e3. This move leads to absolutely insane complications. It's very, very strong, but it is a little bit outside the scope of this video. So again, if you like analyzing Bobby's games on your own, rook e3, I highly recommend looking into that move. Instead, knight to h6 played by Bobby in the game. Very solid move. Of course, the threat, you are hitting the king, and the king cannot go to h8 or g7 as the bishop currently controls both of those squares. So here, the only legal move for black is going to be king to f8, getting out of the attack. But then Bobby playing a move we talked about very recently, rook to c1, lining up the rook with the black queen on the c7 square. We've seen this idea over and over in these Ruy Lopez positions. Bobby always trying to line up his rook with the black queen, and it always seems to work out. And that is definitely true in this position. All right, here, what should black be doing? Well, the computer likes the idea of trying to simplify. One way of doing that is taking on d4, and then after queen takes d4, jumping in with the queen to the c3 square, trying to get those queens off the board as fast as you can. Instead here, Viktor goes for a slightly slower move, rook a to c8, getting the rook and the queen on the c-file and bolstering the bishop on c3. However, again, this does very little to slow Bobby down. Here, Bobby, bishop a6, a very strong multi-purpose move. First of all, you have the attack on the pawn on the a6 square. The rook used to be on a8, but now it's on the c8 square, and that means the pawn on a6 is definitely undefended here. So, very strong idea. But beyond that, Bobby's showing the strength of putting his rook opposite the black queen. Here, the rook is threatening various ideas. Bobby can even go bishop takes c3 next if he wants to. So here, Viktor has to respect that threat. He goes queen to a5, getting the queen out of the attack of the rook. However, the queen may be a little bit misplaced here. Instead, queen d8 may have been a little more accurate, keeping the queen closer to the defense of the king's side and also not blocking the a-pawn. After queen to a5, that pawn on the a-file is blocked. Yes, the queen does defend it, but black's going to have a very hard time getting in that a5 to a4 break that he needs to get counterplay going on the queen side. Now here, Bobby, he doubles rooks on the c-file, rook ec2. Very, very good move. Now, of course, that bishop is pinned. Now it's no longer pinned to the queen, but instead it's pinned to the rook on the c8 square. For example, if black takes on d4, bishop takes d4, then bang, rook takes c8, wins the rook. If black takes back, white, of course, recaptures with the other rook. So that would be devastating. So bishop takes d4, not a possibility. Here instead, black goes knight to e5, putting pressure on that bishop on d3. Not a bad idea at all. But here, Bobby, bishop f1, getting out of the attack. The bishop now does a very good job of defending the king side, and that means he can really be aggressive with all of the other pieces. All right, here, black, knight c5. Viktor Korchnoi trying to bring his last piece into the game. But the problem with this move is it removes another defender of the bishop on c3, that being the rook on c8. And here Bobby spots the idea. He just takes on c3 with the bishop, and then he recaptures the pawn with the move rook takes c3. And here Bobby wins a pawn on the spot. All right, let's do inventory. Here, Bobby Fischer is up a clean pawn. He also has the safer king, and black has a ton of dark square weaknesses around his king. Again, Bobby consistently getting fantastic positions in these closed Ruy Lopez positions. All right, how is black going to defend? Viktor starts with the move king g7. Not a bad idea, putting pressure on the knight on the h6 square. Now, white retreats the knight, knight g4. Bobby Fischer offering a trade of the knights. That knight on e5 being a very good piece, so not a bad idea. Now Victor takes the knight, white takes back, and here Victor Korchnoi goes rook to b8. Decent idea. Now, I do want to point out here, this pawn on e4 square, it looks like it might be hanging at first glance. However, that is simply not the case. Again, knight takes e4 is met by rook takes c8, winning the rook on the spot. So you obviously can't do that. Instead, here, Victor, rook b8, getting the rook out of the pin, and now knight takes e4 is a threat, as rook takes c8 is no longer a threat here. So now, Bobby, what do you do? Do you defend the pawn on the e4 square, perhaps the move like rook to e3? That is possible, but it's also very slow. Instead, Bobby, he has a flair for aggressive chess. He loves to attack. Instead, here he goes rook to f3. Very good move. Lining up the rook with the f7 square. That's going to be, again, a big weakness in this position for black. Now here, black takes the pawn on e4. Material is now equal. And now, Bobby, queen to f4. Threatening queen takes f7. That would be a disaster for black. He has to respond immediately. Now, there are a few different ways to respond to this threat. For example, you can move the rook to either e7 or the other rook to b7, trying to defend along the 7th rank. Instead here, Victor Korchnoi goes f5, a very risky move in the Ruy Lopez for black, but especially in this position. Here, Bobby Fischer, he smells blood in the water. He's like a shark. He goes in for the kill. He starts with the move rook to e3, lining up the rook on the e-file, creating more threats. Now Victor, he does not want to play passively here. He jumps in with the rook to the e5 square, rook to e5, threatening simply rook takes d5. All right, Bobby Fischer, he sees this idea, and instead of worrying about it, he counterattacks with the move rook to c6, threatening the d6 pawn in certain lines. Now, this game is getting incredibly tense here. What should black be doing? Well, first of all, rook takes d5 is actually playable. It's the strongest idea. But here, Bobby Fischer has a wide variety of very strong moves. For example, bishop c4 is very playable, putting pressure on the rook and reactivating the bishop to a stronger diagonal. That is the move I think Bobby Fischer would have gone for in this game based on his very active, aggressive playing style. Instead of that, here black goes for a very weak move, rook b to e8. Bobby Fischer, I suppose in time trouble, this was move 38. But here, Bobby, he finds a powerful idea. Rook takes d6. Brilliant. Now, of course, knight takes d6 will be met by recapturing the rook on the e5 square with a fantastic game. Instead of that, here Victor goes queen to a1. Now, this move turns out to be a big mistake. Instead, Victor had to think about ideas like g5 immediately putting pressure on the queen. Instead, after queen to a1, white just wins the pawn on the a6 square with the rook. Rook takes a6. Now white is up 2 full pawns, the pawn on d5 and the pawn on b3. He also has pressure on the queen, and he has a safer king. How is black going to defend this position? Victor jumps in with the queen to the d4 square, trying to centralize the queen. But then Bobby, rook d3, very powerful move. Once again, harassing the queen with the rook being defended by the bishop. Now, queen b2, then d6 from Bobby. Bobby knows this passed pawn is so strong, all he has to do is just push that pawn down the board as fast as he can. Now, Victor Korchnoi is an incredible grandmaster. He finds a very important resource for black here, g5. This move harasses the queen, gains space on the king's side, and maybe gives him a little bit of counterplay. Now, Bobby retreats the queen, and Victor continues with the attack, f4. Excellent idea in a practical over-the-board game. But here, Bobby Fischer, he seals the deal with one last perfect move. Queen to a7, hitting the king with check from the a7 square. Once the king moves, there's going to be the threat of simply d7 and trying to promote on the d8 square, and there is simply no way to stop this attack. And for that reason, in this position, with the vicious attack and the 2-pawn deficit, Victor Korchnoi resigns on the spot on move 44 to our hero in this video series, Bobby Fischer. Wow, what a series of games by Bobby Fischer in the Ruy Lopez opening. Bobby Fischer's absolute favorite opening as white. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, show me some love. Smash that like button. Subscribe to my channel. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. In the future, it's going to be the Bobby Fischer playlist, as I'm going to have a lot more Bobby Fischer content coming your way in the very near future. But until that time, I'll see you in the next video.